Iran in the 3rd to 6th centuries. The history of Iran were already a new period compared to previous centuries. The beginnings of feudal relations began to appear. Ardashir, the founder of the Sassanid dynasty, who raised an uprising against the Parthian dynasty in 224, enjoyed the support of the Iranian nobility and influential Zoroastrian clergy. The slave-owning nobility and the Zoroastrian priesthood fought for the creation of a strong centralized state. This state was supposed to serve as an instrument for maintaining their dominant position in the face of aggravated class contradictions between the nobility and priesthood, on the one hand, and the masses of communal farmers and slaves, on the other, who were losing their former independence. In the battle that took place in Susiana, modern Khuzestan, Ardashir inflicted a decisive defeat on the troops of the last Parthian king, who was killed in this battle. In 226, Ardashir captured the capital of the Parthian state, Ctesiphon, on the banks of the Tigris. Following this, Ardashir subjugated all the territories that had previously been part of the Parthian state. The Sassanids continued the struggle begun under the Parthians against the Roman Empire. This struggle lasted for more than 2 centuries, with the main objects of the struggle being Armenia and Mesopotamia. During this struggle, the Sassanids repeatedly won brilliant victories over the Romans. So, the son and successor of Ardashir Shapur I, 241 to 272, in the First War against Rome, 241 to 242, captured Rich and reached the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. His second campaign, 256 to 259, was even more successful. The Roman Emperor Valerian himself was taken prisoner with a large number of troops. The prisoners were used in the construction of a dam and a lock on the Carun River. The remains of the structures built by the captured Romans survived until the 19th century, and were known as the Caesar's Dams, Band Kaiser. In the future, the struggle between Rome and then Byzantium and the Sassanids took place with varying success. As a result of this 2-century struggle, the eastern part of Armenia from 428 became a province of Sasanian Iran. Even before that, in the 3rd century AD, Albania, northern Azerbaijan, was captured by the Sassanids, and then other countries of the Transcaucasus. The Transcaucasian peoples, Armenians, Albanians, Georgians, repeatedly raised uprisings against the Sasanian oppression. So, in 451 there was an uprising of Armenians, Albanians and Georgians against the Sassanids. There were also other uprisings of the Transcaucasian peoples who fought for their independence. In the east, the Sassanids, for almost the entire 5th century, waged fierce wars with the state of the Hephthalites for the capture of Khorasan and other eastern regions. Starting from the 5th century, the power of the Sassanids was firmly entrenched on the shores of the Caspian Sea. And the Sassanids established control over the great caravan route that connected China with Central and Western Asia and with Byzantium. The Sassanids also took over the intermediary maritime trade between the Middle East, India and China. In the field of domestic policy, the Sassanids waged a fierce struggle against any manifestation of independence and independence on the part of local rulers. Already under Ardashir, a system of government was created, which Engels spoke of as an ordered Persian monarchy of the Sassanids. In contrast to the Parthian kingdom, Iran under the Sassanids became a centralized state headed by the King of Kings, Shahanshah. The most important persons in the empire after the king were the head of the clergy, the commander of the troops and the official in charge of finances and food. The entire empire was divided into 18 provinces, satrapies, which were ruled by satraps personally appointed by the king, or Mazbans. Under the first Sassanids, up to the 5th century inclusive, slaveholding relations were still widespread. Tribal ties were also significant among the free population of Iran. But among the free population, a process of class differentiation was already taking place. Most of it turned into a class of peasants, who were gradually exploited by the gradually feudalizing land-owning and slave-owning nobility, and the top priests and warriors. Class differentiation led to the formation, among the free population, of isolated groups, estates. There were 4 main estates under the first Sassanids: priests, warriors, farmers and artisans. The first two classes, priests and warriors, of which the so-called horsemen enjoyed the greatest influence, who were both military leaders and large landowners, consisted mainly of representatives of the landowning and slave-holding elite, and were the main social support of the Sasanian Shahs. In order to suppress the discontent of the recently still free, and now enslaved class of communal farmers, the ruling elite needed a strong centralized power, which became the Sasanian dynasty of Iranian Shahs. This power was also needed in order to keep the conquered peoples in subjection, for example, the peoples of Transcaucasia, who waged a stubborn struggle against the oppression of the Sassanids. The dominant religion under the Sassanids was Zoroastrianism. In addition to Zoroastrianism, Christianity and Judaism were also widespread in the Sasanian state. Zoroastrian priests owned vast temple lands, served as judges, and generally enjoyed extremely great economic and political influence in the country, being one of the most important strata of the ruling class. The enslavement of free farmers and the ever-increasing social inequality provoked discontent and protest from the oppressed masses of the people. At the beginning of the Sasanian dynasty, this social protest found its expression in the form of religious teachings and a movement directed against official Zoroastrianism. By the name of the founder of this doctrine, Mani, who was born in 215 in Mesopotamia, this doctrine was called Manichaeism. According to Mani, Manichaeism was supposed to be a universal religion and replace all existing religions. Therefore, in Manichaeism there were elements borrowed from Zoroastrianism and from Christianity and from Buddhism. The main idea of Manichaeism is the dualistic idea of the struggle between light and dark principles in the world. A person is called by his behavior to contribute to the struggle of a bright beginning with an evil one, therefore he cannot kill people and animals and must abstain from meat food. Reflecting the protest of the masses against the luxury and wealth of the ruling elite, the Manichaeans called for asceticism, celibacy, ascetic life, etc. The teachings of the Manichaeans, directed against the Sasanian state and oppression, against social inequality and enslavement, gained rapid distribution, especially among the urban population. Manichaeism and its preachers were persecuted by the Sassanids. Mani himself, fleeing persecution, fled from Iran and traveled to Turkestan, Central Asia, India and China, everywhere preaching his teachings. In 273, he returned to Iran, but was soon captured and then executed, crucified, probably in 276. The subsequent persecution of the Manichaeans forced them to emigrate to Byzantium and beyond the eastern borders of the Sasanian Empire, where they continued lead your sermon. The most massive popular movement in Iran under the Sassanids, which took place at the end of the 5th, beginning of the 6th century, and is known as Mazdakism, also took on a religious form. At the beginning of the 5th century, almost the entire territory of Iran was gripped by a terrible famine caused by a prolonged drought and crop failures. The famine was followed by massive epidemics of contagious diseases. All these national disasters hastened the explosion of the Mazda Kit Movement. The main force of the Mazda Kit Movement was the oppressed masses of the people. The enslaved communal peasants, slaves, artisans, the urban poor and part of the medium and small landowners took part in the Mazda Kit Movement. The main preacher, ideologist and leader of this movement was Mazdak, after whom the movement got its name. Mazdak preached that the main source of all the misfortunes of the people is the existence of property. He preached the need to establish the community of property and slaves. These demands expressed the desire of the enslaved peasants to return to the old communal order, to restore the communal form of ownership of the land, the instruments of production and products of labor. These orders seemed to them the golden age. By returning to the old, the Mazdakites dreamed of restoring the economic and social equality of people. The uprising of the Mazdakites began in 488 in the capital by destroying the grain warehouses of the Shah and the rich, and then quickly spread to the provinces and engulfed the whole of Iran. This movement spread especially widely in the northern Caspian provinces of Iran. The rebels seized the lands, irrigation facilities and property of the nobility, exterminated its representatives, and restored agricultural communities. The movement gained such strength and captured such wide sections of the population that even the Sasanian Shah Kavad himself joined the Mazdakites, who sought to use the rebels in the struggle against the extremely strengthened feudal aristocracy. The Mazdakites enjoyed the patronage of Kavad throughout the first quarter of the 6th century, having significantly weakened the influence and power of the nobility with the help of the Mazdakites. Kavad gradually began to seek rapprochement with the weakened nobility and clergy and move away from the Mazdakites. At the same time, the Mazda Kit movement was weakened by the fact that it could not oppose anything progressive to the social system against which it opposed, and embraced only a part of the working population, namely, Persians by origin. At the same time, this movement isolated itself from possible allies, the oppressed masses of non-Iranian peoples. After the reaction had become sufficiently strong, at the end of 528, or at the beginning of 529, the persecution of the Mazdakites began. Their top leadership, led by Mazdak himself, was exterminated. Massive terror was carried out throughout Iran against the Mazdakites, as a result of which about 80,000 people were killed. Despite the fact that Mazdakism was defeated, it was still of great importance in the history of Iran. As a result of this movement, the economic and political dominance of the secular and spiritual nobility was largely undermined. The weakening of the secular aristocracy and the higher clergy took advantage of the son of Kavad, Horof-I Anushirvan, 531 to 579. Declaring himself the heir to those lands whose owners died during the Mazda Kit movement, Horof-I distributed these lands among the commanders loyal to him, thus providing himself with a reliable support. He also introduced tax and military reforms. An inventory of all cultivated lands was carried out and fixed rates of a piece rate tax were levied twice a year. While previously the collection of taxes and their amounts were entirely dependent on the arbitrariness of officials and local feudal lords, this reform increased the flow of funds to the royal treasury. The military reform of Khosrow-I consisted in an attempt to create a regular army from armored cavalry and infantry, recruited from peasants. All these reforms of Khosrow-I led to the strengthening of the power of the Shah and the central government, and at the same time to the strengthening of the state as a whole. The social base of the Sassanid state was also strengthened. In the face of the formidable danger of the popular movement, Mazdakism, various groups of the ruling class rallied together and supported Khosrow. The reign of Khosrow-I was the period of the highest prosperity of the Sassanid state. During the Sasanian period, a complex and rich culture developed in Iran. Not only the Persians, but also many other peoples of Western Asia took part in the creation of the culture of Sasanian Iran: Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, Indians, Sogdians and other Central Asian peoples. The craft in the Sassanid era had already largely separated from agriculture and reached a high level of development. There were dependent artisans who worked for the nobility, artisans who worked as semi-slaves in the Shah's workshops, but along with them, in the 6th to 7th centuries, free artisans also appeared who worked for the market. Works of artistic crafts, such as weaving, were very famous. Sasanian silk fabrics were of great artistic value and were exported far beyond the borders of Iran. Pottery and metal production was also highly developed. The Sassanids often practiced the resettlement of skilled artisans from conquered countries in order to develop handicrafts in Iran. Trade played an important role in the economy of Sasanian Iran. Foreign trade with Central Asia, China, Africa, Arabia, India, and, first of all, with Byzantium was especially important. In the field of sciences, medicine, etc., the Iranians under the Sassanids apparently lagged behind their neighbors, Greeks, Syrians, and Indians. Science was closely connected with religion. The literary language of Iran in the Sasanian era was the Middle Persian language. Pahlavi. Language began to penetrate from the northeast, from Central Asia. Dari, which served as the basis of the new Persian language, and later received the name Farsi. Under the Sassanids, Iran already had a fairly rich literature, mainly of a religious nature, as well as music. In Sasanian Iran, chess became widespread, apparently from India. Architecture, under the Sassanids, also reached a high level of development. The remains of a number of buildings of the Sasanian period have been preserved: the palace in Firuzabad, the ruins in Shapur, 3rd century, Khosrov's palace in Ctesiphon, 6th century, the castle in Karsasheri, 6th to 7th centuries, etc. Of great importance in Sassanid art was sculpture, reliefs on rocks depicting solemn moments from the life of Shahs. Sasanian art of this kind has survived to this day in the resting places of Iran. Particularly interesting are the grotto and bas-reliefs, take Bostan, near Kermanshah, and the so-called Naqsh Rostam, in the Persepolis area. There is evidence that during the Sasanian period, wall painting also existed in Iran. Quite a few monuments of artistic crafts have come down to us from the Sasanian era, the remains of artistic fabrics, products made of precious metals. The world's best collection of items made of precious metals is in the State Hermitage Museum in Leningrad. Particularly famous are flat silver bowls or dishes depicting various episodes from the life of Shahs, hunting, feasting, various mythological subjects, animals, etc. The result of the strengthening of the Sasanian state in the 6th century was its further military successes. Resumed under Kavad, after almost a century of interruption, the wars in the west with Byzantium at first took place with varying success. In 572, the Sassanids captured Yemen, which was very important for maritime trade, in Arabia, driving out the Abyssinians from there. But long continuous wars weakened the central power of the Sassanids. In 589, part of the Iranian nobility, led by Bahram Chubin, commander of the troops stationed in South Azerbaijan, opposed Shah Ormuzd for 579 to 590. Ormuzd was killed and Bahram Chubin was declared Shah. The son of Ormuzd, Horov Parviz, in the fight against Chubin turned to the Byzantine Emperor Mauritius for help. With the help of Byzantine troops, Bahram Chubin was defeated, and Horov II Parviz, 591 to 628, took the Sasanian throne. Having eliminated Chubin's speech, Horov Parviz was forced to make serious concessions to Byzantium. A significant part of Armenia, up to Lake Van, and half of Iberia, Kartli, were transferred to Byzantium. Between Byzantium and the Sassanids, an eternal peace was concluded, which in fact lasted a little more than 10 years. After the uprising of 602 in Constantinople, as a result of which Mauritius was executed and the centurion Foch, nominated by the soldier mass, was put on the imperial throne. Horov II began a new war against Byzantium and took away all the territories ceded by Iran to Byzantium. In the second decade of the 7th century, the Sasanian troops of Khosrow II Parviz captured a number of Byzantine provinces: Ansh, Edessa, Damascus, Jerusalem, Syria and Palestine, Cilicia and even Egypt. Having passed through Asia Minor, the Sasanian troops reached the eastern shores of the Bosporus. And only the absence of a fleet made it impossible for them to begin the siege of the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. But after a few years, Byzantium went on the offensive against the Sassanids. The Sasanian troops were defeated by the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, who in 628 reached almost the very capital of Sasanian Iran, Ctesiphon, on the banks of the Tigris River. At the same time, the Sassanids had to wage a fierce struggle on their northwestern and northeastern borders against the advancing Turkic tribes, who acted in alliance with Byzantium. In 628, the son of Khosrow II, Kavad Sharuya, made a palace coup, overthrew his father from the throne and took the Shah's throne. To strengthen his position, he entered into an alliance with Byzantium. Under a peace treaty with Heraclius, he renounced all the conquests of Iran and withdrew Iranian troops from Egypt, Syria, Armenia and other countries occupied by them in the west. Meanwhile, processes were taking place inside the Sasanian state that weakened it and prepared for its death. The exploitation of the broad masses of the people, the peasantry and the handicraft and trade strata, intensified. Long and intense wars further ruined the working strata of the population and weakened the state of the Sassanids. Class contradictions sharply aggravated, the discontent of the masses grew. The process of feudalization led to the strengthening of separatist aspirations and to the weakening of the central government. All this paved the way for the relatively easy conquest of the Sassanid state by the Arabs.